the Uncommon Living podcast, where we talk about the science, technology, and practical wisdom to build physiological and psychological resilience. I'm Thomas Seager. I'm an associate professor of sustainable engineering at Arizona State University and CEO of the Morozko Forge ice bath company. My guest today is Brigham Young University professor Benjamin Bikman. Ben is an expert in the action of insulin in the body and the author of the book Why We Get Sick, where he describes how every leading cause of death from chronic illness in the United States originates in metabolic disorder. Ben Bikman, thanks for coming to visit.
Hey, Tom. Oh, my pleasure. It's been really fun to just sort of peek behind the curtain. The Wizard of Oz.
You are at the Morozko Forge production studio. We are shooting the Uncommon Living podcast, and it's my privilege to have Professor Ben Bikman here to tell us about the action of insulin and teach us some about the metabolism.
Yeah, my pleasure. That is the only thing I know anything about. So don't ask me about any other topic. Yeah.
We were talking in the car on the way over here about the oversimplification of the calories in, calories out hypothesis. This comes from a metaphor of the machine.
Yeah.
If you're talking about an internal combustion engine, then of course you can measure the fuel efficiency, but humans are complex. And I think you and I don't think much of calories in, calories out. What's wrong with that?
No, yeah. So in fact, if I'm correct, I believe the origins of the whole view of the human being this repository of energy comes from the original ideas of thermodynamics, which itself stems from the pursuit of the optimal steam engine. We're not steam engines. That while we have heat and we move, that's kind of where the similarities end. But that concept gave rise in the pursuit of a better steam engine to invoking this idea of heat, which is what a calorie is, and then against all logic, those rules were then applied to human nutrition. But that's wrong in so many ways, the least of which is we don't eat units of heat. What we quantify as calories is meaningless in a way. You know, for example, if we eat a hot piece of bread, does that have more calories than a cold piece of bread? It is in fact hotter, which is what a calorie is. Strictly speaking, there are more units of heat. And of course, that's silly, and I would want the listener to think, well, that's silly, because it is a silly concept. That's not to say what we call calories, or what we would more accurately refer to as just carbons that can be put to work in the body. It's not to say that doesn't matter, but the complexity of the human body, rather than being like a steam engine, is more akin to an orchestra, where all of the different systems or tissues of the body are the different sections of the orchestra. And then there are, in fact, multiple conductors. But if we were to lump them all into one, a singular conductor would be the endocrine system, or in other words, the hormones of the body. It's the hormones that tell different parts of the body when it's time to play or be quiet. How does the fat cell know when it's time to be taking in calories? And in the process, depriving muscle of some calories. Mm-hmm. When does the muscle know that it's time to not only take in calories, but in fact it's time to grow and get bigger and stronger, as opposed to putting that energy into the fat cell? Because you won't have states where you're feeding both. You know, the muscle working is so opposite to the fat cell storing that it's the hormones that tell the cell what to do. And in fact, that is, I believe, the best way to describe the hormone insulin. When it comes to energy in the body, insulin is the one hormone to rule them all. It will tell, its thematic effect from top to bottom will be telling that cell what to do with the energy that it has access to. Even in those tissues where insulin isn't directly facilitating glucose uptake, like muscle and fat, and speaking of both of those, both highly responsive to cold, by the way, of course, but insulin will still tell other tissues of the body what to do with the energy. Is it time to store and build up? Is it time to break down and release? Or in other words, promote an anabolic time, building up, or promote a catabolic. And as much as we have now a culture where people invoke metabolism and metabolic health, metabolism is nothing more than the sum of its two parts, the building up or the anabolic and the breaking down or the catabolic. And of course, it's hormones that dictate all of that.
There's a popular misconception about insulin, and I blame the American Diabetes Association for this, that blood sugar is the problem with diabetes, that you should take more insulin to keep your blood sugar low. The misconception is that the insulin is somehow benign, but you write about hyperinsulinemia, that is too much insulin in the body. Will you tell us more?
Right, yeah, for sure. In fact, if there was one thing that I could change, if I could wave my magic wand, or because I'm a scientist, press the thumb on the little pipette in the lab as my magical device here, I would do it such so that the glucose-centric paradigm of metabolic health, including type 2 diabetes, shifted to have an insulin-centric paradigm. Our failure to look at insulin is somewhat justifiable. So as critical as I am of the glucose-centric approach, I also can reluctantly nod my head at the fact that it has become common because of the historical precedent, being that historically, since ancient Egypt and beyond, the most common symptom of diabetes was the production of urine. That's what diabetes means. And that's a function of the high blood glucose. And then scientifically, glucose is a lot easier to measure than a petite little peptide. Glucose is so easy to measure that you can strap something on your arm and measure it constantly. We're not even close. We're a decade away from being able to do that with insulin, or indeed any hormone. So I can understand why the conversation started with a focus on glucose, not to even mention that we didn't even know what insulin was until about 100 years ago. So I can understand why, but now it's no longer forgivable. Our failure to acknowledge that the main character is insulin and glucose is just a sidekick, it means that we detect the problem much later than we should. You can detect elevated insulin 10 or 20 years before the glucose ever starts to climb. And so this is the canary in the coal mine metabolically. And then at the same time, as you noted, giving a failure to acknowledge the insulin means you could take a type 2 diabetic, which is a person who's become insulin resistant to the point that now they can't keep their glucose in check. And you're so determined to only fix the glucose that you'll give them even more insulin. And it has now been decades of evidence showing the more you push the insulin up in order to correct the glucose, all while enjoying perfect glucose levels, the type 2 diabetic triples their risk of dying from heart disease, doubles their risk of dying from cancer, doubles their risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and they get fatter. So we can check the box that we've lowered their blood sugar levels, but if it does so at the expense of increasing insulin, it is an absolute net negative. We've made them fatter, sicker, and killed them faster.
I think it was Peter Drucker who said there's nothing worse than the right answer to the wrong problem. And what a great example.
Yeah.
But there's something confusing about metabolism that we should mention, and that's ketones. My son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 6 years old, and he was in a condition called ketoacidosis when he was admitted to the pediatric ICU. Maybe it's ketoacidosis that causes people to think that ketones are dangerous. And in a type 1 diabetic, a state of ketosis can be dangerous. But in people who make their own insulin, ketones are an intermediary metabolic fuel for your cells, but not one that you see on a nutrition label. Will you tell us more about it?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, ketones are probably one of the most triggering, and I mean for that word to be a little insulting, when it comes to conventionally trained dietitians, that there is a group of people in the midst of all of their education, they hear the word ketone and it is like a dog who's seen a tennis ball bounce by, and they can focus on nothing else but that 4-letter word, and it's a curse word to them. It must be because two factors, I would guess. One, the phenomenon that there really is a situation where ketones get so high that it disrupts the pH balance in the body and they do become acidic, which is lethal. Ketoacidosis. But then I also suspect, so that would suggest, that would defend the view that ketones are harmful. But then when you combine that with the view that persisted up until just about 20 years ago, which is that ketones are metabolic garbage, it was considered an absolute wasted byproduct. And if there's one thing we're learning more and more about the body, it is that there's almost nothing that's actually wasted. When you have something that's there and being made and sticking around in the blood, it's probably serving a specific purpose. Even something, just as a brief tangent, like something like bilirubin. People think of jaundice. Well, that is one of the most powerful antioxidant molecules in the bloodstream. And people who have chronically elevated bilirubin levels have like an 80% lower risk of dying from heart disease. And it could be nothing more than its ability to just scavenge oxidative stress. So much of what we've classically viewed as harmful is not only not harmful, but in fact is beneficial. And when it comes to ketones, they are one of the unsung heroes of metabolism. And to use an analogy, lest people misunderstand ketoacidosis versus ketosis versus the average global diet citizen, you only make ketones when insulin is low and has been low for about 16 or so hours. That can wiggle around a little bit. Why is that? It's because when insulin comes down, fat burning comes up. And when fat burning has been activated for a certain period of time, the body's burning more fat than it needs for its own energy needs, like the liver, for example, that it then starts creating these products of fat metabolism, namely ketones. So you start to make ketones, but again, you only do so when your insulin is low for some extended period of time. The average individual is eating roughly 70% of all calories from carbohydrates, which is going to spike insulin, and they're eating 5 or 6 times a day. So they're spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin, meaning they're never getting any ketones. That would maybe be like a person whose ketones are a single match. They've striked a match and now they're burning a little match. In contrast, a person who is, by restricting carbohydrates or fasting, they will now be in ketosis. That may be like in a home, that's just the fireplace. Very under control, it's very managed. Ketoacidosis is the whole house is burning down. And as you noted in the intro to the question, if you make insulin, it is essentially impossible to get to ketoacidosis.
Be in acidosis.
You and I could shrug our shoulders and fast for 2 weeks straight, and we would not get into ketoacidosis. It is practically impossible. There are some exceptions where if you're like fasting and you're low carb and you start binging heavy alcohol, because of the metabolism of ethanol, you can get into some ketoacidosis. So there are some instances where you can push it, but for the most part, it is impossible. And thus, the only time to really fear ketoacidosis is if insulin can be 0, which is type 1 diabetes.
Right.
But that's going to be, of course, very, very dramatic. But mentioning type 1 gives me a fun opportunity to really put the cherry on top of the view of the relevance of insulin when it comes to telling cells to store energy. Because a type 1 diabetic may learn that they can be as skinny as they want and eat whatever they want. They don't have to starve themselves. They don't have to vomit it up and have a conventional eating disorder. All they need to do is underdose their insulin, and they will be as thin as they want. That is so common and well known that it has its own name called diabulimia.
No kidding, because now they're peeing out all that blood glucose.
Well, so not only, I mean,
but
it's
they also
so,
might go blind.
the consequences are disastrous. Right. There is a metabolic storm raging in their body. Their glucose levels are 10 times higher than they should be. Ketones are 20 times higher than they should be. They're burning up and rotting, but they look thin, which if you've got that eating disorder, that's the only thing you care about. But imagine the temptation. Imagine a young teenage girl, for example. She is used to being very thin because as an untreated type 1 diabetic, she would be.
Right.
She's learned if I just poke myself less with this needle, but the body is so incapable of storing energy in that state, in the absence of insulin, it will be excreting energy in the form through the urine, both ketones and glucose. The body will be breathing out ketones, which have a caloric value, and the metabolic rate will be about 20% higher. Independent of any just wasting of calories, the body is just burning hotter.
I think you're bringing this up because the experience of the type 1 diabetic gives us insight into the role of insulin in every human body.
That's right.
Insulin is the hormone that signals energy storage. If insulin is chronically low, and it can be controlled by underdosing or underbolusing your type 1, then we see these sort of walking natural experiments in a lack of energy storage.
Exactly. You can see why I'm so clear on that topic. As much as people want to try to criticize the endocrine theory of obesity, suggesting that insulin matters, you can prove it.
Yeah.
Now, this isn't to say calories, as we call them, don't matter. To just bring it back to the fat cell, there must be a signal that tells the fat cell to grow. That is insulin. No other signal matters. Cortisol, thyroid, it doesn't matter. ACP, it's only insulin. Because we know, because if we just remove that one single variable, it's gone. So you have to have a signal telling the fat cell to grow, but then you need the structure. And that's where the calories or the carbons from calories come in, because you have to fuel that growth. So there's the signal to promote growth, then there's the calories to fuel the growth. So it's not to say calories don't matter. They do, but only insofar as the fat cell knows what to do with them.
You mentioned that most people have to go super low carb for at least 16 or 17 hours to reach a ketogenic state. And I think if they're not going in with some metabolic flexibility, if they've never been in ketosis, it might even be longer, 2-3 days.
Agreed.
But I think there's also an exception, and the exception is the cold plunge.
Yeah.
When you get into the cold plunge, your liver will release glycogen stores. You've activated the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and so you're getting ready for that fight or flight. But it's a temporary glucose spike. Either brown fat or shivering in your muscles will clear that glucose out of your bloodstream. And almost immediately, the white fat cells will release lipids into the bloodstream to replace that fuel source for thermogenesis. As part of that metabolism, as part of that cold thermogenesis, ketones will be produced. I've measured this in my own urine just to kind of prove to myself this experiment, and there's some good literature on this too.
Well, we need to publish more on this topic, but what you just articulated describes a ketogenic state where if you've activated the sympathetic nervous system, which we know very well happens with cold immersion, you've stimulated these receptors on the fat cells called the beta-3 adrenergic receptors. They're very responsive to the sympathetic nervous stimulus. Now you are releasing free fatty acids into the bloodstream. Those free fatty acids can have multiple fates. They could be stored somewhere else, but only if insulin's elevated. And moreover, if insulin's elevated, the fat cell wouldn't have been releasing them in the first place. But in this state, assuming you've gone in with a whiff of lower insulin, then I would strongly imagine, and wouldn't be surprised at all to learn that that does enhance ketogenesis, because if you can stimulate an increase in free fatty acids from the fat cell, all while insulin is low, if insulin's low, you have to burn those fats. They have no other fate. And so you start burning more fat. When you burn more fat, you make more ketones. And all the more important, of course, if you are depleting the liver of its glycogen, that also appears to be a necessary sort of metabolic switch. That is, hepatic or liver glycogen or stored glucose starts to go down, ketogenesis will accelerate. And then you noted, part of what's interested me in human metabolism and some of the human evidence we've accumulated is looking at the effects of ketones on white fat, where we published a paper with human data finding that when humans were in ketosis, the metabolic rate of their belly fat, their white fat from the belly, went up 3 times. It tripled. And so now imagine the power of combining a low-carb state or intermittent fasting with cold therapy. Now you are taking the metabolic machine that's been put into motion as kind of a basal state with the diet and then getting this trigger. Now, I say a trigger, but as we all know who've done it before, you can have that effect for hours.
After
so that 4 minutes, 3-4 minutes in that ice bath, you may have initiated a response that's going to go for 3 or 4 hours.
I think we feel that.
Oh, I sure do.
Yeah. You've got a Morozko now.
Yes.
And you were telling me you plunge in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, you're in there.
I do.
What is the ice bath doing for you?
Yeah, I really cannot say enough about it. It is such it's this funny moment actually where I look at it with a degree of dread and a degree of, I'm eager to do it. I'm anticipating it. I want to do it because it's like a good workout. I know when I get up out of there, I will feel so much better. So right now,
I've never regretted an ice bath.
Never, never once. As we are recording this in the kind of getting near the end of winter in Utah, it is dark late into the morning. I am naturally a terrible sleeper, I'm also naturally kind of anxious. I really get a little amped up quickly and have to really work to kind of calm my body down. That last part is much better handled. There's something about that sympathetic trigger in the morning that makes the rest of my day go into a bit more of a flow state. But I sleep better. I swear, in the absence of data, this is purely just speculation, you hear so much about people stating in the morning, what you got to do is get some daylight on your eyeballs. Well, that's hard to do when the sun doesn't come up till 9 or 8:30 or whatever. I'm up at 5. I want my clock to get started. I am convinced that that trigger that early in the morning sets my circadian clock going such that when 9:30 rolls around, I'm ready for lights out.
Yeah.
I feel my body wanting to start winding down. That parasympathetic is starting to dominate in the wake of such a sympathetic stimulus that come nighttime, I find that I'm able to just float right into sleep in a way. I've not tried evening ice bath exposure. I've heard some guys rave about that. My schedule is such that it's just so much better for me to do morning, and that's what I've been doing.
I do it in the morning too. Some people say evening and it helps them sleep, but for me it's the opposite effect.
I would be worried about that.
Yeah, because it gets you revved up.
Yep.
But people have different rhythms.
Totally.
I'm just one of those that will do it in the morning. But speaking of anticipation, you're working on a new book. You've told me a little bit about it.
Yeah.
The Case Against Carbohydrates.
Yeah.
What more is left to be said? I thought you said it all and why we get sick.
I know, yeah. So it actually was born from talking a lot with Dr. Sean Baker, where I was increasingly curious how people were reversing chronic and even debilitating autoimmune diseases. Now, I'm not an immunologist. I'm not an immune disease scientist. I'm a metabolic scientist. But it got me more and more curious about what is an aspect of dietary carbohydrate that goes beyond the endocrine or the hormone response, which is why we get sick was focused on. I thought there's something else to be said here. And so the primary focus of the Case Against Carbs is the effects of the hyperglycemia itself, the effects of glycemic variability, the effects of the anti-nutrients in carbohydrates that you do not get from proteins and fats from animal sources, and then the effects of what has been treated on those plants to help them not get killed from other little critters. So the effects of pesticides and herbicides. And so that's sort of the first book. The book has two parts. It's sort of outlining how dietary carbohydrates, fruits, vegetables, grains, grasses, how they can create a problem, and then it's overviewing the evidence. Like the chapter I just got done working on, and it's kind of meant to be a little cheeky, where one of the chapters is carbs make you stupid, and I basically outline the evidence now, having described the problem, and look at the evidence suggesting how when a person's in like chronic hyperglycemia, it literally shrinks the brain.
Yep.
Glycemic variability compromises cognition.
That's not cheeky, that's true.
Yeah, so it's the title that's cheeky, where each chapter is like, carbs make you ugly. And I talk about the process of like pickling the skin, you know, and carbs make you dumb, carbs make you sick from one thing or another.
This sounds like a book that the world is ready for. Like the world needs this book. This is
Yeah.
way beyond the Atkins diet or what people sort of get on.
Right, right.
pop
Well, I mean,
literature.
you and I, as much as we share an academic journey of getting that illustrious PhD, we're also uncommon academics where we rail against the futility of traditional academics, which is a person who's content to do nothing but think of an idea and talk about it.
Yeah.
That's not enough. If you can't turn that knowledge into some action, then what's the good? It's like the academic version. If a tree falls in the forest, does anyone here? If an idea comes
publish
to
in
life in a
Nature.
university, and you publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, did it ever really happen?
No.
It's just gone into the ether. And so where you and I have been so aligned, in addition to our interest in metabolism, each coming at it from our own distinct areas, it's actually moving in an area, in a direction in such a way as to constantly challenge ourselves with the question, is my knowledge set valuable in the real world? And to my delight, I've been able to, I believe, answer yes to that. Equally to my delight is seeing what you're doing with an entirely new approach. The idea that cold immersion is capable of influencing so many aspects of human physiology. What to me was originally just a way an interest where I touched on cold immersion a little bit in my book. To me, that was the beginning and the end of cold immersion. It's an ice bath is going to help you improve your insulin sensitivity. Done.
Which is great to know.
Next chapter. Yeah, but where you're taking it now is getting into the realm of nervous system regulation, getting into endocrinology with hormone production and other disease states that I know you're pursuing, with looking at the effect of something as seemingly simple as, hey, let's challenge the temperature in the body, and now let's start going down the checklist of chronic disease. It's an uncommon academic who's going to do something like that.
That's well said. I've got the Uncommon Testosterone is my new book coming out this week, even as we're recording it. You wrote the foreword.
Oh,
Thank you for
much
doing
to my
that.
delight. Oh, my pleasure. I'm an elite company to be able to get early access. And again, as a professor who teaches a graduate class in endocrinology, the idea that cold immersion would influence this, that's not in any textbook.
It's remarkable.
And to my great delight, and my great pride, I don't rely on textbooks when I prepare my lectures. Now I need to revise my syllabus to include a new section of sex hormone production.
Today we have to keep it short so we can get you to a lecture that you're giving at my home institution, Arizona State.
Yeah.
So I'm going to thank you for being here. I hope that we can get together again.
Oh, my
because
pleasure.
It would take us hours to exhaust all the topics we want to talk about.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is great.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of what you're doing.
Thanks for joining us on the Uncommon Living Podcast.